Some people leave a house behind. Others leave a heartbeat that never learns how to stop waiting. 3 years after disappearing without a single goodbye, Naomi Carter stood once again before the towering wrought iron gates of Romano Manor. The mansion looked exactly as she remembered it, its limestone walls glowing beneath the late afternoon sun, its tall windows reflecting a sky painted in soft shades of gold and blue. Time had touched everything beyond those gates, but somehow this place seemed untouched, as though it had refused to move forward without her. A small leather envelope rested in her trembling hands, worn around the edges from countless nights of hesitation. Inside was a single letter she had rewritten more times than she could remember. It wasn't a request. It wasn't an apology she expected anyone to forgive. It was simply goodbye. The security guard studied her for a long moment before his eyes widened with unmistakable recognition. His posture straightened almost instantly, and for a second, he looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. "Miss Carter," he whispered, disbelief softening every word. Naomi forced a faint smile that never reached her tired eyes. "I'm only here for a few minutes," she replied quietly. "Please don't tell anyone. I just need to leave this letter." But before he could answer, the massive front doors of the mansion slowly opened. The sound echoed across the stone courtyard with a weight that made Naomi's pulse stumble. Staff members appeared one after another, not speaking, simply watching. Some had grown older. Others were new faces. Yet every expression carried the same stunned silence, as if they were witnessing someone return from another lifetime. Naomi lowered her eyes. She hadn't planned for this. She had imagined placing the envelope on the front steps, turning around, and disappearing before anyone noticed she had ever come back. That was how she wanted this story to end. Quietly, without reopening old wounds. Without seeing the man she had spent 3 years trying, and failing, to forget. She took one careful step toward the entrance before another sound stopped her completely. Slow footsteps echoed. From somewhere inside the mansion. Measured. Calm. Familiar enough to awaken memories she had buried beneath endless miles and sleepless nights. Every member of the household instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path through the grand foyer without a single spoken command. Naomi looked up almost against her own will. Ethan Romano descended the marble staircase with the same composed presence the world associated with power, yet something about him had changed. His dark tailored suit remained immaculate, his posture unshaken, but the quiet confidence that once felt untouchable now carried the unmistakable weight of years spent carrying something invisible. His gaze found Naomi immediately, as though it had never forgotten where she belonged. Neither of them spoke. The distance between them stretched no farther than 30 feet, yet it held 3 years of unanswered questions, silent tears, unsent letters, and dreams neither had dared to replace. Finally, the elderly housekeeper standing near the staircase pressed a trembling hand against her mouth and whispered words that made every heartbeat inside the mansion seem to stop. "Sir, she's really here." Ethan never looked away from Naomi. His voice remained low, steady, and almost impossibly gentle. "I know," he said. "I've been expecting her every day for the last 3 years." Naomi could not force herself to take another step. The letter in her hand suddenly felt heavier than it had only moments before, as though every word inside carried the weight of the 3 years she had tried to leave behind. Ethan remained where he was, neither rushing toward her nor asking the questions that had haunted both of them for far too long. His restraint unsettled her more than anger ever could. Around them, the staff quietly slipped away until the enormous entrance hall belonged only to the 2 people whose silence seemed louder than any conversation. The scent of polished oak, fresh lilies, and old books drifted through the air exactly as Naomi remembered. Even the grandfather clock near the library marked each passing second with the same steady rhythm that had once comforted her during lonely evenings after finishing her work. It was impossible to believe that an entire lifetime had happened beyond these walls while everything inside them appeared frozen. Her eyes wandered almost by accident toward the reading room across the hall. The worn blue armchair beside the fireplace still sat beneath the tall window, where she used to spend 10 stolen minutes every afternoon reading borrowed novels before returning to her duties. The small ceramic mug she had accidentally chipped one winter morning still rested on the bookshelf instead of being replaced. Someone had carefully repaired the crack with delicate gold lacquer, turning an ordinary mistake into something unexpectedly beautiful. Naomi swallowed hard. She remembered apologizing over and over, insisting she would pay for it from her paycheck, only for the head housekeeper to smile and quietly tell her that Mr. Romano had instructed everyone to leave it exactly where it belonged. At the time, she believed he had simply forgotten about it. Now she was no longer certain. Ethan noticed where she was looking. His expression barely changed, yet something softened behind his calm eyes. "Nothing has been moved," he said quietly. The staff asked several times. "I told them no." Naomi looked back at him, unable to understand why such ordinary words hurt more than accusations ever could. "You should have changed everything," she whispered. "People are supposed to move on." Ethan lowered his gaze for the briefest moment before answering. "People often say that because they believe time does the work for them." His eyes met hers again with quiet honesty. "Sometimes it does not." Naomi tightened her fingers around the envelope until the paper inside bent beneath the pressure. She had rehearsed this visit for months. She had imagined speaking with confidence, offering gratitude, leaving the letter, and walking away before old memories could reach her. Instead, every familiar corner of the mansion unraveled another thread she had spent years trying to tie back together. She finally extended the envelope toward him. "I came because there were things I never said." Ethan accepted it with both hands instead of opening it. Immediately, he treated it with the same care someone might give an irreplaceable photograph. After a long silence, he looked at the handwriting on the front, slowly tracing her name with his thumb before speaking again. "If this is your farewell," he said softly, "then allow me one conversation before either of us decides it has to be the last." Naomi hesitated before giving the answer he deserved, because the truth had never been simple enough to fit inside a single sentence. She slowly lowered her eyes toward the polished marble floor where she once spent countless mornings carrying fresh flowers from the garden into every room of the mansion. The reflections beneath her feet reminded her of another afternoon years earlier, when she had first crossed this same entrance carrying nothing more than a worn duffel bag and a recommendation letter folded neatly inside her coat pocket. She had expected another temporary housekeeping job. Instead, she had unknowingly stepped into the place that would quietly reshape her entire life. During those first weeks, she learned every hallway, every window that caught the morning sun, every creaking stair that echoed after midnight, and every routine that kept the household running with almost invisible precision. She also learned one rule that no employee ever questioned. Mr. Romano valued privacy above conversation. He spoke politely, thanked every member of the staff by name, and treated people with quiet respect, but he rarely allowed anyone close enough to know the man behind the reputation. Naomi accepted that distance without complaint. She believed her purpose was simply to work honestly, send money to her grandmother in Atlanta, and slowly build a future that belonged entirely to her. Yet life inside the mansion revealed small moments no newspaper would ever print. On rainy mornings, she often found an extra umbrella waiting beside the servant's entrance after forgetting hers the day before. During long winter shifts, hot tea somehow appeared in the pantry before sunrise without anyone admitting who had prepared it. When she spent evenings reading library books after finishing her duties, the reading lamp was always switched on before she arrived, although she never saw anyone enter the room. She convinced herself these were coincidences. She never imagined that someone had quietly noticed the smallest details of her ordinary days. Ethan remembered them all. He remembered the way she paused to admire the roses blooming along the eastern garden every April. He remembered that she always chose the oldest hardcover novels instead of the newer editions because she liked the notes previous readers had left inside the margins. He remembered that every Sunday, she carried homemade cookies to the elderly groundskeeper instead of eating dessert herself. None of those memories came from grand conversations or dramatic confessions. They were built from hundreds of silent observations collected over months until they became impossible to forget. Naomi finally looked back at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never understood why this place always felt different." Ethan smiled with quiet sadness. "Because you were one of the few people who never treated it like a palace." She frowned slightly, confused by his answer. He continued before she could respond. "Everyone else saw marble floors, expensive paintings, and impossible expectations. You saw a home that needed care. The words settled gently between them, carrying a truth Naomi had never realized he had noticed. For the first time since walking through the gates that afternoon, she began to understand that the years they had shared under the same roof had never meant the same thing to each of them. And somewhere inside the silence they had both mistaken for distance, something far more fragile had quietly taken root long before either of them had found the courage to give it a name. The quiet that had settled between them was interrupted only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock, and Naomi realized that some silences were not empty at all. They were filled with memories waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. Ethan slowly turned the envelope over in his hands, but made no attempt to break its seal. Instead, he walked toward the tall windows overlooking the eastern garden, where the first autumn leaves drifted across the stone pathway. "Do you remember the oak tree?" he asked without looking back. Naomi followed his gaze. The enormous tree still stood proudly beside the fountain, its branches stretching wide across the courtyard exactly as they had years before. 1,000 memories returned at once. That was where she used to eat lunch whenever the weather was warm enough. It was where she called her grandmother every Sunday afternoon. It was where she believed no one ever noticed her. Ethan smiled faintly, almost to himself. "You thought you were always alone there." Naomi looked at him with quiet surprise. "Was I not?" He shook his head. "My office window overlooked that tree. Nearly every afternoon, I watched you sit there with a book or a sandwich wrapped in paper towels. You always smiled at the birds before taking the first bite." Naomi felt her heart tighten. She had never imagined anyone paying attention to details so ordinary. "Why would you watch me?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated before answering, as though choosing the truth required more courage than silence ever had. "Because after a long day filled with people asking for money, influence, or favors, you were the only person in this house who never wanted anything from me." Naomi lowered her eyes, unable to respond. She remembered another afternoon not long before she disappeared. A black sedan had arrived unexpectedly, and several distinguished visitors entered the mansion carrying folders and briefcases. She had accidentally walked past the study while serving coffee and heard laughter coming from inside. Through the partially open door, she had seen Ethan standing beside an elegant young woman dressed in white, listening as an older gentleman congratulated them on what sounded like an engagement. Before she could step away unnoticed, the woman had slipped her hand through Ethan's arm and smiled with complete confidence. Naomi had frozen for only a second before quietly returning to the kitchen, convincing herself that whatever hope had secretly begun growing inside her heart had never belonged there in the first place. She never asked a single question. She never gave Ethan an opportunity to explain. That very evening, she packed her belongings after everyone had gone to sleep. She left a short resignation letter with the head housekeeper, thanked her for every kindness, and disappeared before sunrise. She believed she was protecting herself from a future built on impossible dreams. Standing inside the mansion once again, she finally whispered the memory aloud. "I thought you had chosen someone else." Ethan slowly turned toward her, genuine confusion crossing his face before giving way to quiet understanding. The pieces of a story broken for 3 years suddenly began fitting together in ways neither of them had expected. "So that is what you saw," he said gently. "And you never stayed long enough to discover what actually happened." Naomi searched his face, hoping to find even the smallest sign that he was trying to comfort her with a gentle lie, but all she found was quiet sincerity. Ethan walked toward the library and motioned for her to follow. The room welcomed them with shelves lined from floor to ceiling, the familiar scent of aged paper lingering in the air exactly as she remembered. He stopped beside an antique writing desk near the fireplace and slowly unlocked its top drawer. Naomi expected business documents or family records. Instead, he carefully lifted out a stack of cream-colored envelopes tied together with a navy ribbon that had faded with time. There were dozens of them, perhaps more than 100. Every envelope carried the same name written in the same unmistakable handwriting. Naomi Carter. Her breath caught. Ethan placed the bundle gently on the desk, as though it contained something too fragile to survive rough hands. "I wrote one almost every week," he admitted quietly. "Sometimes when I believed I had finally found the right words. Sometimes when I had no words at all." Naomi stared at the letters without touching them. "Why did you never send them?" she whispered. Ethan rested one hand on the back of the chair beside him before answering. Because I promised myself that if you left by your own choice, I would never use my influence to pull you back into a life you no longer wanted. Naomi slowly looked up, her eyes already shining with emotion. You knew where I was? Ethan nodded once. Most of the time. Her expression filled with surprise. He continued before she could misunderstand. I never asked anyone to interfere with your life. I only wanted to know that you were safe. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. She remembered changing apartments twice, taking new housekeeping jobs in different cities, believing she had quietly disappeared into an ordinary life. Yet somehow, without disturbing her freedom, Ethan had made certain she was protected from a distance. Every birthday, he continued softly, I learned that you were healthy. Every Christmas, I asked whether you had a warm place to stay. Every spring, I hoped someone would tell me that you had finally found happiness. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment, overwhelmed by a kindness she had never imagined. She had spent 3 years convincing herself that she had been forgotten almost immediately after leaving. Instead, she discovered that someone had quietly measured time by the hope of hearing her name again. Ethan untied the faded ribbon and handed her the first envelope. The date written in the corner was only 4 days after she had disappeared. With trembling fingers, Naomi opened it and found only a single handwritten sentence. If leaving this house helps you find peace, then I will pray that peace follows you wherever you go. Tears blurred the words before she reached the signature. She reached for another envelope dated 6 months later. The roses bloomed again today. I realized no one smiles at them the way you did. Another followed. The library feels strangely silent now. Another. The oak tree has begun losing its leaves. I still look toward it every afternoon without thinking. Naomi could no longer count the tears quietly slipping down her face. None of the letters begged her to return. None tried to persuade her. They simply preserved moments of an ordinary life that had never stopped making room for her absence. And for the first time since walking back into Romano Manor, she realized that the years they had lost had not been empty at all. They had been filled with love spoken only through patience, respect, and hope that refused to disappear. Naomi carefully returned the letters to the desk, unable to trust her voice. Every page had quietly dismantled the story she had repeated to herself for 3 years, the story that Ethan had simply accepted her departure and continued living without looking back. Instead, she found a man who had honored her freedom even when it meant carrying his own unanswered questions alone. She drew a slow breath before speaking. I was wrong about so many things. Ethan did not rush to agree. We both were, he answered gently. Silence has a way of convincing people that it is telling the truth. Naomi gave a faint, bittersweet smile. Then there is one more truth you deserve to know. Ethan remained still, giving her the same patient attention he had offered from the moment she walked through the front doors. Naomi looked toward the rain beginning to gather outside the library windows, watching tiny drops trace quiet paths across the glass. After I left, I found work in Nashville, she began. A family hired me to care for their home while both parents worked long hours. They treated me with kindness, and I kept telling myself I had finally found the ordinary life I thought I wanted. She paused, choosing each word with care. But no matter where I lived, every place felt temporary. Every room reminded me of another room. Every garden reminded me of another garden. I realized I had not left this house behind. I had only carried it somewhere else. Ethan listened without interruption. Naomi continued, her voice growing quieter. Last winter I visited my grandmother. She asked me one simple question. She asked whether I had ever truly said goodbye to the people who changed my life. I told her I had written letters. She smiled and said that letters can carry words, but they cannot carry forgiveness unless they are delivered. Naomi lowered her eyes to the envelope now resting beside Ethan's hand. That is why I came today. I believe the kindest thing I could do was thank you for everything and finally close the door I left open. Ethan looked at the unopened envelope for a long moment before carefully sliding it back across the desk toward her. Then I cannot accept it. Naomi frowned with quiet confusion. You have not even read it. He nodded. Because I already know it was written by the woman who believed she understood the entire story. His voice remained calm, carrying no accusation, only gentle certainty. But the woman standing here today has only begun to discover what truly happened. Naomi felt the weight of his words settle deep inside her heart. There were still unanswered questions. There was still the elegant woman she had seen years ago, the congratulations she had overheard, the reason Ethan had never tried to stop her before sunrise on the morning she disappeared. Ethan slowly walked toward a small cabinet built into the library wall and removed an old photograph inside a simple silver frame. He handed it to Naomi without saying a word. She studied the smiling faces captured in the picture, and almost immediately her eyes widened with astonishment. The elegant woman she had believed was Ethan's future bride stood beside him, but between them was an elderly couple whose faces she instantly recognized from newspaper articles about one of the city's largest charitable foundations. On the back of the frame, written neatly in black ink, were 6 words that changed everything she thought she knew. Celebrating the launch of the Romano Foundation. Naomi held the photograph with both hands, as though one careless movement might erase the truth it carried. The smiling woman she had believed was Ethan's future wife was standing several inches away from him, her arm linked instead with the elderly founder of the charity, whose generous donations had transformed schools and community centers across the state. The congratulations Naomi had overheard that evening had never been about an engagement. They had celebrated the launch of a foundation dedicated to scholarships and housing assistance for families rebuilding their lives. A misunderstanding she had accepted as fact had quietly rewritten the course of 2 lives. Naomi closed her eyes, remembering how quickly she had packed her suitcase before sunrise, how convinced she had been that leaving without a single conversation was the only way to protect her heart. "I never gave you the chance to explain," she whispered. Ethan slowly nodded. "And I never gave you a reason to believe you could ask." His honesty carried no bitterness, only reflection. "I spent years believing that keeping my distance was the safest thing I could offer you. My world came with responsibilities that were never simple, and I convinced myself that caring for you meant allowing you to choose a life untouched by them." Naomi looked at him through tear-filled eyes. "You made that decision for both of us." Ethan accepted the words without argument. "I did." The room grew quiet again, but this silence no longer felt heavy. It felt truthful. Ethan walked toward one of the tall bookshelves and carefully removed an old hardcover novel with a faded green cover. Naomi recognized it immediately. It had been her favorite book from the mansion library, the one she had borrowed so many times that she had memorized entire passages. She smiled in disbelief when he placed it gently into her hands. A small pressed white rose slipped from between the pages and drifted onto the desk. Naomi stared at the delicate flower, perfectly preserved despite the passing years. "I found it after you left," Ethan said softly. "You were using it as a bookmark. I thought you might come back for it." Naomi carefully touched the fragile petals with the tip of one finger, overwhelmed by the realization that even the smallest pieces of her life had been protected inside this house. She laughed quietly through her tears, a sound neither of them had heard in years. "I cannot believe you kept all of this." Ethan's expression warmed with the faintest smile. Hope has a strange habit of making ordinary things impossible to throw away. Naomi looked around the library one more time, noticing details she had overlooked when she first returned. The reading lamp still stood beside the armchair. The blue blanket folded neatly across its arm was the one she had knitted during a snowy winter evening. Even the tiny ceramic bird she had bought at a local craft fair remained on the windowsill facing the eastern garden. Nothing had been preserved because it was valuable. Everything had been preserved because it belonged to a memory they had unknowingly shared. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes to meet Ethan's once more. "If everything I believed was wrong," she asked gently, "then why did you never come after me?" Ethan's quiet smile faded, replaced by an expression carrying 3 years of patience, sacrifice, and one final truth that had remained locked inside his heart longer than any letter he had ever written. Ethan did not answer immediately. He walked toward the rain-speckled window and watched the evening light settle over the garden that had quietly connected their lives long before either of them understood why. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had repeated the same truth only to himself for years. "Because love that demands someone to stay is not love. It is possession. I could never do that to you." Naomi stood motionless, every word finding its way through the walls she had built around her heart. Ethan turned to face her again, his expression peaceful despite the sadness lingering behind his eyes. "The morning you left, I found your resignation letter on my desk. I read it more times than I can count. I wanted to drive after you. I wanted to ask you to come back. I even reached the front gate before the car was ready." He smiled softly, almost embarrassed by the memory. "Then I realized something. If I asked you to stay before you understood your own heart, you might remain out of gratitude instead of love. I could not accept that." Naomi felt tears gathering once again. "So you simply let me go?" Ethan nodded. "Every day after that felt like a choice. I chose to believe that if our story was real, life would eventually return you here. And if it did not, then at least I would know you were living the life you had chosen freely." Naomi slowly walked closer until only a few feet separated them. "You gave me freedom even when it hurt you. It was the only gift I knew would never become a burden," he replied. She looked down at the unopened envelope still resting on the desk between them. The goodbye letter no longer felt like the ending she had imagined. During countless lonely nights, it belonged to a woman who had lived inside assumptions instead of truth. Carefully, she picked it up and looked at the familiar handwriting before quietly tearing the envelope in half. Then she folded the pages once more and placed them into the fireplace where no fire had yet been lit that evening. Ethan watched her without speaking. Naomi smiled through quiet tears. Those words were written for a story that never really happened. For the first time that afternoon, genuine warmth reached Ethan's eyes. He opened another drawer beneath the writing desk and removed a small velvet box that had clearly rested there for years. Naomi looked at it with surprise, but he did not kneel, and he did not open it immediately. Instead, he placed it gently in her hands. "3 years ago," he said, "I bought this after deciding that one day, when the time was right, I would ask whether you could imagine building a future with me. The time never came." Naomi carefully opened the box. Inside rested a simple platinum ring with a single small diamond that caught the fading sunlight without extravagance. It was elegant, understated, and somehow perfectly reflected the man standing before her. Ethan smiled gently. "Today is not a proposal. I have waited too long to rush another decision. I only wanted you to know that hope has been living in this house far longer than either of us realized." Naomi closed the box with trembling hands and held it against her heart. For the first time in 3 years, neither of them was standing inside a misunderstanding. They were standing inside the truth, and somehow, after everything they had lost, the future no longer felt like something slipping away. It felt like something quietly waiting to begin. Naomi held the small velvet box against her heart as the last rays of sunlight faded beyond the tall windows, bathing the library in the warm glow of evening lamps that had quietly illuminated this room through every season of waiting. She looked around one final time, no longer seeing a mansion filled with memories she had lost, but a home that had faithfully protected them until she was ready to face the truth. The years they had spent apart could never be returned. Yet neither of them wished to measure life by what had been taken away. They had both discovered that love was not proven by dramatic promises or impossible sacrifices. It revealed itself through patience, quiet respect, and the courage to leave another person free to choose their own path. Naomi stepped closer to Ethan until only a single step remained between them. "I cannot promise that I know what tomorrow looks like," she said softly. 3 years taught me that life changes faster than we expect." Ethan nodded with complete understanding. "Neither can I." She smiled through tears that no longer carried regret. "But I know one thing now. I do not want fear to make another decision for me." Ethan looked into her eyes with the same calm expression she had first noticed years earlier, but this time she finally understood what had always been hidden beneath it. It was never coldness. It was carefulness. It was a man who believed that genuine love should never become another person's obligation. Naomi slowly reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with quiet certainty, not as someone claiming victory, but as someone welcoming home a soul he had never stopped believing in. Outside, the rain had ended, and a faint ribbon of golden light broke through the clouds, touching the eastern garden where the old oak tree stood taller than ever. The housekeeper appeared quietly in the doorway, pausing when she saw them standing together. A gentle smile spread across her face before she disappeared again without interrupting the moment. Some reunions did not need witnesses. Ethan glanced toward the front entrance before looking back at Naomi. There is one thing I have wanted to say since the day you walked away. Naomi waited in silence. He smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes at last. Welcome home. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment as those two simple words settled into the empty places that 3 years of distance had never managed to fill. She realized she had not returned to recover the past. The past had already done its work. It had taught them both that assumptions can separate hearts, but honesty can bring them back together. She slipped the velvet box into her coat pocket, not because a decision had been made, but because hope deserved another chance. Together they walked toward the front doors, where the cool evening breeze carried the scent of fresh rain and blooming roses through the open entrance. Behind them, the mansion no longer felt like a monument to lost time. Ahead of them, the long stone pathway stretched beneath a clearing sky, inviting two people who had finally stopped running from the truth to begin writing a new chapter together. And on that quiet evening, without grand speeches or impossible miracles, two hearts discovered that the longest journey is sometimes nothing more than finding the courage to come home.